members on this committee today. MP Boularis for Mr. Cannings, and we have MP Shanahan, and we've also got MP, where are we at here? Area. So anyway, it's really nice to have you, and we appreciate Ariel's silent appearance today. I'm sorry you're not well, and welcome back, Lloyd. We missed you last meeting. Okay, so welcome to meeting number 86 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Science and Research. Before we begin, I would like to remind all members and other meeting participants in the room of the following important preventative measures. To prevent disruptive and potentially harmful audio feedback, incidents that can cause injuries, all in-person participants are reminded to keep their earpieces away from all microphones at all times. As indicated in the communique from the Speaker to all members on Monday, April 29th, the following measures have been taken to help prevent audio feedback from incidents. All earpieces have been replaced by a model which greatly reduces the probability of audio feedback. The new earpieces are black in color, whereas the former earpieces were gray. Please use only a black-approved earpiece. By default, all unused earpieces will be unplugged at the start of a meeting. When you are not using your earpiece, please place it face down on the middle of the sticker for this purpose that you will find on the table as indicated. Please consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. The room layout has been adjusted to increase the distance between microphones and reduce the chance of feedback from ambient earpiece. These measures are in place so that we can conduct our business without interruption and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. Thank you for your cooperation. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. For those participating virtually, I would like to outline a few rules to follow. You may speak in the official language of your choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. If interpretation is lost, please inform me immediately, and we will ensure interpretation is properly restored before resuming the proceedings. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. If you are on the video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. A reminder that all comments by members should be addressed through the chair. With regard to a speaking list, the clerk and I will do the best we can to maintain consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they are participating virtually or in person. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I'm informing the committee that Jackie Jacobson hasn't completed? Has not, okay, in advance of the meeting. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083I and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, January 31st, 2023, the committee is commencing its study of science and research in Canada's Arctic in relation to climate change. So it's now my pleasure to welcome Michel Allard, Professor Emeritus, Center for Northern Studies, Laval University, and from the Arctic Research Foundation, Tom Hennifer, Chief Executive Officer by video conference. Will Jackie be participating? Okay, but they're there on screen. So Jackie Jacobson is a board member of the Arctic Research Foundation. He is on screen, but because of the headset situation, will not be participating from an audio perspective. And Agnes Cockney, Community Engagement and Northern Specialist, also from the Arctic Research Foundation. So can we begin with Michel Allard for 5 minutes with your opening statement.
You all hear me? Yeah. Bonjour, je vais présenter en français.
Good morning. I'll be making my presentation in French. My name is Michel Allard. I'm a professor emeritus at Laval University. You can see that from the color of my hair. I was and am a researcher at the Centre for Northern Studies. I'm a member of the Canadian Permafrost Research Community, and I was a research member of ArcticNet for several years. My work focuses on the impact of thawing permafrost on natural environments, including the formation and transformation of lakes and rivers. Changes in temperature and thawing of permafrost caused by shrub growth and increasing snow cover, which we call the greening of the Arctic. Geotechnical characterization studies of permafrost under transport infrastructure, particularly airports and in the built environment of northern communities. With the knowledge acquired in this way, we help design adaptation solutions in engineering and land use planning for decision makers. We also monitor permafrost temperatures in eastern Canada, from Nunavik to the high Arctic, by means of a network of thermal cables inserted into boreholes. Managed by the Centre for Northern Studies, this is the largest university-based monitoring network in Canada. I'd like to talk about the consequence of thawing permafrost, the repercussions. Permafrost covers 40 to 50% of Canadian territory. Its thickness varies from a few meters at the southern margin to several hundred meters deep in the high Arctic. The temperature of the permafrost varies across the country with climate, with air temperatures. As the air warms, the permafrost warms. Once it reaches 0 degrees, it thaws. The ice it contains melts, and that causes ground subsidence that radically transforms systems and causes damage to infrastructure. In natural environments, thawing permafrosts disrupts the tundra and forests. That alters the living environments of animals and the nature and availability of traditional indigenous food resources. Disruptions, as well as the formation of new lakes or the draining of existing lakes, can also make it more difficult to move around the territory and to access food resources. Moreover, some areas of northern Canada are also being hit by large landslides. On the territory, we're measuring gains and losses of carbon in the form of organic matter, carbon dioxide and methane associated with permafrost thawing. We call this the permafrost carbon feedback, and this is how we quantify it. In the built environment of Inuit and First Nation communities, the unstable permafrost is combining with a serious housing crisis. We need to ensure that existing buildings and those that are to be built in large numbers in the near future will be stable. Stability can be achieved by selecting suitable land to build, rock, for example, or by designing foundations that will withstand the climate changes of coming decades. A tremendous research effort needs to be undertaken with northern communities and governments of the territories to characterize soils, plan and design foundations according to building type and function, and plan urban development. It is impossible to plan catchment of water sources, but distribution networks and the disposal of wastewater as well as waste disposal must take permafrost into account.
But you'll have an opportunity to answer questions.
Okay.
So we're limited to 5 minutes with the opening. Thank you so much. Okay?
It's done? 5 minutes?
Yes, it's done. Your opening statement is done.
Okay,
Correct.
thank you.
Okay, we look forward to hearing your testimony. So we'll now turn to the Arctic Research Foundation And Mr. Hennifer and Mr. Cockney, you have a total of 5 minutes between you, so however you want to distribute that time.
Thank you. We spoke beforehand, so I'll start us off if that's okay. Madam Chair, honorable members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to speak to you on the important issue of Arctic science and research in relation to climate change. The Arctic Research Foundation is a nonprofit charity that enables and catalyzes community-led science and infrastructure projects in the Arctic. We work with communities to build networks of NGOs, universities, researchers, and governments to fund and deliver programming while providing access to ships, green energy-powered mobile labs, and other research infrastructure. There are many issues that need addressing in regard to science and climate change in the Arctic, but there is a single common factor making it harder to address problems and capitalize on opportunities. Unlike other Arctic nations, Canada lacks a cohesive, cross-departmental, holistic national strategy for the Arctic. Let me back up and discuss some of these issues. Shockingly, the Arctic Ocean may be ice-free in less than a decade. The region is warming at least 4 times faster than the rest of the world. Many Northerners are living through devastation. Communities are losing up to 90% of their buildings to fire and flood, sometimes both in a single year, and even collapsing into the very ground as permafrost erodes. But climate change is far from the only issue. China is increasing its holdings in the north, including purchasing a stake in the Northwest Territories rare earths mineral mine, and they have added the Arctic to its Belt and Road Initiative. They're creating a new form of capitalistic colonialism that's making rapid inroads into Canadian territory. At the same time, the United States denies Canada's claim to sovereignty over the Northwest Passage. Even amidst its war against Ukraine, Russian submarines are testing the boundaries of Canada's waters, and we have no idea what other countries may be up to under the surface. Now, I highlight issues related to sovereignty and security in addition to science because it cannot be overstated that these issues are deeply intertwined and must be addressed as such. Other nations see the value in tackling these problems together and are taking decisive action to address them. In 2022, the United States adopted the National Strategy for the Arctic region. This strategy mandates that the entire government work cross-departmentally to address Arctic issues. But no such strategy exists in Canada, and government departments are far too often working in isolated silos, leading to duplicated effort, wasted time, and wasted taxpayer money. Upon realizing the federal government's lack of a national vision for Canada's Arctic, ARF stepped into the policy world to develop a draft implementation plan for Canada's Arctic and Northern Policy Framework. We call it the Arctic National Strategy, and we offer it up to parliamentarians as a foundation upon which to build this holistic strategy for the North. The strategy is built around 4 pillars: reconciliation and the co-production of knowledge, protecting the environment while understanding and adapting to climate change, capacity building and economic development, Arctic data governance and management. It was written in collaboration with Northern senators, leaders, and communities, and is built out of high-impact recommendations, common-sense policy changes, and shovel-ready projects that can have a meaningful impact on the biggest issues facing the Arctic. And we'll be submitting this policy to the committee for your review. These recommendations range from piloting new ways to conduct fish stock assessments, to changing federal funding structures, to investing in green energy-powered containerized agriculture to help alleviate food shortages. Here's one example relevant to the committee's study from the strategy. While research is now conducted with more community consultation and collaboration than in the past, federal grants are still administered through a system that is based on Southern ways of thinking. They have enormous administrative burdens, and grants for Arctic research follow the same procurement rules as grants to study Lake Winnipeg or the forests of New Brunswick. This means that while communities may have more funding in theory, in practice, it can be very difficult to actually get those funds out the door. These grants also rarely carry additional funds to reflect the dramatically increased costs of operations, goods, and transportation in the Arctic. Universities have experienced researchers, dedicated staff, and departments with expertise in applying for government funds, as they should. But it is not fair to expect communities, many of which may only have a handful, if any, full-time, permanent administrative staff to shoulder this same administrative burden. The Canadian government needs to modify funding and grant application structures to be more equitable for Northerners. And I mean, you can see this in a number of different ways where government structures are simply too rigid to work properly in the North. And a very good example of that is, unfortunately, I understand the needs for translation and all that, but because Jackie is in the North and has been traveling, he was unable to procure a headset. And as a result, he's unable to testify at this committee. And I think that's a very poetic example of how these structures work. Now, my remarks have been submitted already, but I'm going to cut it short there so I can give Angus a chance to speak. So, Angus.
You have 30 seconds, Angus. He left us 30 seconds. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair and members. Recently, Laurie Idlout, the MP for Nunavut, had shared our Arctic Research Foundation document, the Arctic National Strategy, and you know what she called it? Impressive work, right? I don't think she's biased, coming from the north for sure, but I think she sees what we're all talking about here with the troubling effects that are happening in the Arctic. I just want to take it down to perhaps more of a personal level. You know, community members are worried and concerned with what's happening, especially with the coastal erosion, right? You know, a prominent political member of Tuck, you know, once said, "I want to be buried in Tuck." But I'm not even sure of that now. That's how personal it's getting. My cousin, Nawala Cockney, a retired RCMP, her house foundation was being pounded by waves last summer. You'd think she'd want to move south or to a safer place, but she says, "This is my homeland. I'm not moving." So I think we should all take heed to Laurie Idlout's encouragement for all levels of government to use our Arctic Research Foundation document, the Arctic National Research Strategy. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to stop you there, and hopefully maybe during the first question you'll get a chance to enlarge. I know you each had wanted 5 minutes, but that would take 50 minutes and take away from our questions. So we're really looking forward to hearing your testimony. So now we will open the floor to questions, and we'll start with MP Toker for 6 minutes. Please indicate your questions to whom they are directed.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and to Mr. Hennifer. Thank you for being online today and describing some of the differences in life. And I've been honored to be able to travel to the territories, all three on a couple different occasions, and very concerning about the permafrost melting or warming and the impacts that it has. And it reconfirms our belief that the main environmental program of this government is the carbon tax, which we know doesn't lower emissions based on the last 9 years of measurements. And how this ties to the territories is the carve-out in Atlantic Canada that made it unfair for the rest of the Canadians that was using home heating oil was also, there's a carve-out in the Arctic, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about how that rebate works up there.
In terms of the legislation, that's the way that the government is legislating the carbon tax is outside of our mandate. We're an apolitical organization, but we encourage any action that can lower carbon in the future and in the present. And there's been a lot of evidence that shows that carbon taxes do work. But I can say that I'm from the Atlantic provinces. I'm from New Brunswick, and I know that the fuel costs there have had. We're making things difficult for people, but that's much more difficult in the north. There absolutely does need to be a carve out in the Arctic for fuel. I mean, almost every community is reliant on diesel power or diesel fuel to power their power plants in the north. It's messy, it's inefficient, but it's the infrastructure that's there right now. And life is already so expensive. I mean, you can pay $14 for a head of lettuce in some of these communities if you can even get it. And the cost of the carbon tax should not be passed on to people who are in the north, who are already experiencing the worst of climate change anyway. But in terms of the carbon tax as a whole, it's likely a positive initiative because there needs to be work done to mitigate climate change. But yes, there absolutely needs to be a carve out. But Angus can speak. Angus is from Tuktoyaktuk, so he can speak more to the actual realities on the ground there.
Questioning a little bit further with you. So if you're concerned about lowering emissions, aren't you concerned that the carbon tax hasn't lowered emissions in Canada? And in 9 years, your permafrost is still, unfortunately, warmer and disappearing? And
It doesn't work like that. You don't pass legislation and the next day climate change is solved. I'm not interested in getting into an argument about the federal government policies and what they are. I think that there's very strong evidence internationally that carbon taxes generally are an effective way to lower emissions. But in terms, and there needs to be a price for carbon, plain and simple. It's not free. We release this into the atmosphere, and it causes serious damage. There needs to be a cost associated with that, plain and simple. But like I said, I'm not interested in I think your question is asked in somewhat bad faith, to be frank, and that I'm not interested in talking politics. We're talking about what's happening in the North, what's happening in terms of science, not what is going to influence the election in the next couple of years. That's not what this is about. So thank you for your question, but frankly, I think
it is very relevant because politically speaking, it's ineffective, the measures that this government has enacted on lowering emissions. The proof is in our ranking around the world, and the fact that our emissions have gone up since they introduced the carbon tax, and the only year that it went down was the year that we all were locked down and didn't move. So that was the concern. That is the political side of things, is that the policies that impact the North are having a negative impact. And you shared about the cost of living crisis up there right now and how this is making more expensive. Meanwhile, believing that the tax measure that is making everything more expensive is something you want excluded from your budget.
I'm saying that not our budget. I'm saying that there needs to be a carve-out for people who live in the North. Absolutely. The cost of living is high enough, and they're already living through these climate change, the challenges that come with climate change being so much more severe there. But there needs to be action taken. What is your, I mean, as I said, I'm not an expert on the government legislation in terms of the carbon tax. We're doing primary research. But my understanding, and I think it's very well understood in the scientific community and among economists, that globally carbon taxes have worked well. But I think we're wasting the committee's time getting into an argument about this. We're here to talk about science in the North, not government policy in regard to the carbon tax. And I don't know what your suggestion is to do something in place of it, but something needs to be done.
So get your thoughts on SMRs or micro reactors in the North so that we can replace that diesel that is transported up, that you're right, that is the high emitting source, and look towards other sources of energy such as nuclear.
I think that there's a lot of potential in small and medium-sized reactors. They're safe. They generate a lot of power. Obviously, they're expensive. But the key thing is going to be, do the communities want it? There's a lot of distrust of people selling goods and new technologies in the North that rightfully needs to be overcome. There needs to be a lot of consultation and collaboration done with the communities to find out about that. That's not a question that that's best asked of me. It's a question that's best asked of Angus and Jackie and the other people living in and from the North.
That's our time. Thank you for your testimony. So now we will turn to MP Longfield for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I'd like to get back to our study on research and the challenges that we're facing. I'm really interested in that report that's been generated. I think that's base information that we need for this study, and the earlier we can get a hold of that report so we can go through it, the better. My question, starting with Mr. Hennefer, and then I'd like to go over to Mr. Cockney, around how research is different in the Arctic, where research in southern Canada, generally, you have a university attached to a geographic area that applies for research and does research based on their geography, but also the ties to other southern universities, where in the Arctic, we don't have a university network, and often the universities have to apply for NSERC funding and cobble together research grants to be able to do Arctic research. I'm thinking of the Pearl Research Station up in Ellesmere Island in Eureka, where the University of Toronto has the main presence, but tries to cobble together enough research to do climate change study and study on permafrost with other universities around the world. Could you talk about how we could provide a different way of networking research funds together that could either be led by a southern university or led by the people in the Arctic?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the challenges of doing research in the Arctic are enormous. It's much more expensive. We run a fleet of near-shore research vessels. The cost to run them in the north is huge. One of them, our vessel that gets the most work is based out of Halifax and transits north every year. So you've got 10, 14 days of costs just to get up there. But the keeping it in the north itself, we do have other ships that are kept in the north, but a ship that large, there isn't the infrastructure there to do the maintenance that it needs, at least not in the geographical area where it normally works. But there are other challenges as well in addition to costs. Of course, this is, these are settled land claims. This is the Inuit and Northern Indigenous people's backyards. Right. So collaboration is key. It needs to be, we can't just start with the universities. We need to start with the communities. They need to have a say in where the funding goes. But the administrative burden, as I mentioned in my remarks, that they have to go through, the way that these funding structures are set up with universities is it just doesn't work for the North. It's based on a Southern way of thinking, right. and that needs to change. And there's a number of ways that it can be simplified, but those are details that are a bit too complex to go into today. But
if I could interrupt, because those are very important details. If they're not in the report, could you give us something in writing that could suggest some alternate ways of going about this?
Oh, absolutely, and they are in the report. So okay. you'll see them in our strategy. But okay, it's just a lot to go into in a 2 to 3 minute answer. But one of the key things that you mentioned that I do really want to highlight is we need the way that we are able, because we're a nonprofit, we lose money every year in delivering our programming, and we charge as little as we can. But that's still too expensive for most scientists. There simply aren't grants for ship time in the Arctic, or even for using our mobile labs in the Arctic, right. for developing that infrastructure. There's research grants, there's grants to pay universities, to pay researchers, but rarely is there enough money for ship time, and it's based on Southern costs, not Northern costs.
Great.
So what we do is we stack programs.
Okay.
We bring, if they're operating in the same geographical area, we'll bring in the University of Manitoba, the University of Toronto, all to work together. Right. And that way it can be more affordable. So stacking programs is one important thing, but just coordination and collaboration in general is key.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of minutes left, if Mr. Cockney, to fill in some of we just did a research study on Indigenous traditional knowledge and the different approaches Indigenous people use towards science. Whether that could be a lead way of us funding research in the Arctic by going through Indigenous communities. And could you maybe speak to that, whether there's an opportunity there that we could explore in our report?
Yeah, thank you. Speaking of opportunities, when you look at even the U.S. government has adopted the policy to integrate Indigenous knowledge when it comes to science and research with every federal agency. So, for example, NASA, they've approached us, and me especially, to advise them on how to, approach these the communities in the North and engage them in science and research. And really it's community-based, asking the people, what are your priorities in terms of research and science? So I think it's going in the right direction. I hope that researchers, I think, are going in that right direction too in Canada.
So replacing the word university with the word community, and have the communities have access to research funds.
Yeah, more and more, we're even us with the Arctic Research Foundation, we go into a community and we ask them, what are your priorities? We've done a lot of work in Johaven, and especially with the discovery of the ships, for sure, and that was engaging the community first.
Yep. Very good. Well, thank you. I know I'm close on time, so I'll just thank you. Thank you for being here and contributing, and I look forward to the written submissions.
Thank you, MP Longfield. That was great. Okay, now we will turn to MP Blanchard-Joca for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Je salue les témoins qui sont avec nous aujourd'hui pour le début de cette importante étude. Première question va être pour M. Allard. M. Allard, c'est un honneur de vous accueillir aujourd'hui. Tout d'abord, je tiens à vous féliciter.
It's an honor to welcome you here today. I want to congratulate you on your career. It's a real honor to have you here. I had the privilege of visiting the Center for Northern Studies. You've been a member of it for many years. You were a member while you were doing your undergraduate. And we do recognize your entire body of work and your commitment over the years. Ms. Taylor, I'll move to questions immediately. They're very important. You talked about the repercussions of a melting permafrost. I'd like to hear you say how we can prepare and how we can adapt. Because it's not just Canada that's facing this problem. Climate change has no boundaries. How can we work with our closest allies like the U.S. and Greenland to deal with the repercussions of a thawing permafrost? Alaska and Canada are working closer together in their research networks. Our working methods are becoming shared. For example, in mapping permafrost conditions in community and the territories, we're mapping things together to help communities adapt. The issue is to come up with the best scientific programs possible for communities and inspired by communities so that the work can be done in conjunction with them. The communities near me know their problems very well, and many academics have already begun doing this, from Laval University, for example, as well as in the ArcticNet network, which you'll be hearing soon. There are links between Indigenous communities in northwestern Canada. They're very well established, they're very strong, and all Canadian researchers have a great deal of experience. There are funding problems, however. Research needs and research partnerships must be initiated by communities themselves. I will just say briefly that communities and academics, particularly at the CN, are very, very ready and willing to work with communities. I'd like to hear you say more about this cooperation, which is needed to build relationships with the communities. Each community needs a different approach. We understand and respect that. But what about differences? We know that Quebec has a different approach with communities in Nunavik, for example. It seems a bit different from the rest of Canada's. Is there something that you've experienced or discovered at CEN? How can we be as effective as possible? Yes, mapping permafrost conditions in communities and the work to move ahead with adaptation on the ground. Access to hunting and fishing resources is very important to communities, and it's becoming increasingly disrupted by climate change. Construction problems as well. Foundations of homes aren't holding. Landing strips aren't holding. Nunavik is part of Quebec, so it's the Quebec government that has funded quite a number of studies. In Nunavik, 80% of my funding comes from Quebec and 20% from other sources. In Nunavut, it's almost 100% federal funding. Some of it comes from the government of Nunavut. And it's a bit more difficult because it's less predictable. So 80-20, roughly. That's for Nunavik, yes. But when we pay taxes, it's 50-50, isn't it? Well, I know that this is something you do look at as a committee. Accessibility challenges exist as well. You said that some territories are in difficulty. Can you give us some tangible examples? You can't visit these communities in small boats. You need to fly in. Can you tell us what the challenges are: gravel airstrips and paved airstrips. 737 is the 200 is the only one that can land on a gravel airstrip, but they're disappearing. So what about access for researchers? At a recent meeting, we met with the president of Air Inuit, who does have difficulty with gravel airstrips because the new Boeings have to be adapted. They're looking for solutions with what in Quebec we call the NPQ. I think those airstrips will have to be paved in the end. When you pave an airstrip that's on permafrost, you have to take into account temperature changes in the underlying land, cracks that may appear over time, thawing, and the whole maintenance setup, which is so different. It's really a totally different game. But there are needs in the north. Traffic is increasing. And I would imagine that at some point in Canada, we will have to pave airstrips in Resolute Bay and in other small communities because of increasing traffic and to accommodate Canada's strategic interests.
Thank you so much. We will turn now to our guest, MP Boulerice, for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a brief aside. In 20 minutes or so, there will be a counter-protest of people on Parliament Hill who are here to defend women's rights, reproductive rights, and women's control over their own choices. I stand with them. I would have liked to be there. But I'm also very pleased to be here taking part in this very important study. I just wanted to remind everyone that these rights, women's rights, reproductive rights, are always under threat. We can see it in the U.S. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today for this very important study. Mr. Allaire, I'll begin with you. In your presentation, you used a term that's greening the Arctic. It sounds lovely, but it's frightening. I would like you to explain for Southerners who don't know much about this what it really means. In brief, global warming is conducive to plant growth. We're seeing an increase in the number of shrubs in the tundra and trees like willow. The impact this is having on permafrost is that it changes the temperature structure of the ground and it triggers the degradation of permafrost. That has a great many consequences on Indigenous communities. Some communities which hunted caribou are now seeing moose. Now they're not, and communities that grew berries aren't able to because other plants are taking over. So these are major changes with secondary impacts. If I understand correctly, global warming is thawing the permafrost, which has trapped CO2 and methane for millennia. So the release of that carbon dioxide and methane is only going to accelerate global warming. Yes, that's the carbon feedback loop that I was talking about. The fact of having communities with which we can work in all parts of Canada is important. We want to work with communities so that everybody understands the environmental issues and so that we can study what the real carbon release is. I think the feedback's a bit exaggerated. There is a bit of fear-mongering, to be frank, but we do need to measure things. We are seeing that in Nunavut, thawing permafrost is favoring carbon sinks, so we still need to figure out what the final balance will be. Yes, thank you for helping me with my own personal anxieties. But there are repercussions on infrastructure, physical infrastructure like foundations and roadbeds. What can we do to protect northern community infrastructures more effectively? On the initiative of Transport Canada, we had an excellent program called the Adaptation of Transportation in the North Initiative. We targeted a number of northern communities. We worked on major projects like the Nunavik to Tuktoyaktuk highway, highways to Alaska, Iqaluit Airport. This really served as a model for us. My final recommendation in my presentation was to recreate an organization on that mold so that we can have a program to help communities adapt in the North. We need communities and researchers to work together on adaptation research. Do I have more time? Very recently, I read that northern communities could use a tool called thermosiphons to stabilize the permafrost. What is a thermosiphon? It's a very technical device. It works very well. These are boreholes or wells that are dug under the foundations of building, and they basically draw out heat. It's CO2, done through CO2, which is then used in winter to cool the building, to cool the ground under the building. It helps keep the ground under the building frozen to stop subsidence. This works for large buildings like warehouses, garages, concrete buildings. It's too expensive for homes. Wells are the best solutions there.
So we'll now turn to our second round. So it'll be MP Soroka for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome to the position. I'll start off with Mr. Cockney. No one's been asking you questions, so I'll start off. In the past, Jackie Jacobs, and I'm sure many others, have talked about how resource-rich and cash-poor the North is, but what federal policies do you believe are creating barriers to reduce resource development in the North, and what changes would you propose to better harness the economic potential of the North's natural resources?
Yeah, as you know, the Western Arctic, they say, the Nunavik Highway is the road to resources, right? So it's all market driven. So, it's, back in the 70s when the first Trudeau was in office, he pumped a lot of money to companies subsidizing their exploration needs. The Nunavik Highway has been a boon for tourism in Tuk. So as far as, activity there, it's all market-driven, for sure.
Okay. In your view, do federal climate policies align with the economic realities and the environmental needs of northern communities? And could you propose alternative strategies that more effectively balance economic development with environmental protection in the Arctic?
Yeah, I've seen action for sure. I know the government had, the climate adaptation programs, which communities have accessed, and, tried to, I think, mitigate what's happening, especially on the coastline. How do we adapt? But I think they're in Tuk for sure. They're in the mode of prevention. You see, with all the shoring up the shoreline for sure. It's not adaptation, but it's prevention right now. So how do we prevent that from further happening? I'm sure the project now that's occurring in Tuk won't be the last one.
Given the severe housing shortages in northern communities, how do you assess the current government's efforts in addressing this issue? And do you believe there is too much red tape involved in housing?
Yeah, coming from a community level, I was in Tuck there a couple of weeks ago, and certainly the housing issue is evident for sure. It's a challenge getting supplies and so on up there. It's a matter of will, I guess, for the government to inject resources, financial especially. I know back in the day. The government back in the residential school days had the will to build these infrastructure. So I'm hoping that kind of will return for sure in terms of housing.
Since we're on, science and research, federal support for science and research in the North, do you believe current efforts are sufficient? And what changes would you recommend to ensure that Northern scientific research is adequately funded and aligned with the region's unique needs?
Yeah, as far as sufficiency goes, it's never enough, right? It's always going to be ongoing for sure. As far as if the climate continues, certainly we see it accelerated in the last decade or so. So as far as sufficiency goes, it'll never be enough.
Mr. Hefner, in your recent op-ed on the Canadian Arctic strategy, you pointed out concerns regarding foreign interests, particularly from China and Russia in the Arctic. What specific threats do these pose to Canada's interest in the region, and do you believe there are significant government failures when it comes to defense in the Arctic?
I'm not an expert on defense, but I think that in terms of the issue of monitoring, science and environmental monitoring need to be combined with security monitoring. There's just massive swaths of the Arctic that aren't being monitored, and we're one of the only organizations with near coastal ships that work in uncharted waters, which means that we don't know what's going on under them, with the exception of a few ships run by a private foundation, in addition to the government and local ships that are up there. But to go back to one of your earlier questions, I think one thing that's really key that I didn't get to in my opening statement is that first off, there absolutely needs to be more funding for Arctic science. There's no question. It needs to increase. As Angus said, we're never going to get to a point where everything is done. But what really needs to happen is there also needs to be funding to increase capacity in communities, especially around administration. A lot of these communities have one or no or maybe two administrative people, and they're tasked with doing an enormous amount of work to get funding grants out the door, and that just isn't enough. And when the government announces $200 million, $250 million for big research projects for monitoring, for running lakes like Lutsulke that are in charge of a park in the east arm of Great Slave Lake, that money is allocated to science, but there's very little allocated to training and capacity building within the communities, and that needs to change. That needs to be included as well. And because once that happens, then you can grow the economy in these communities. You can get people working, having meaningful jobs, and working towards building their own science.
I'm sorry, that's our
initiatives.
time, but thank you so much for those great questions and answers. So now we will turn to our next MP, Jazik. She will have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for your presentations and your testimony so far. Ma première question est pour Professeur.
My first question is for Professor Allard.
Mr. Henheffer from the Arctic Research Foundation about what they've been working on, in other words, a national Arctic strategy. And I must say, as I looked at the material prepared for us by our wonderful analysts, I was very much struck by how many institutions, colleges, universities, not-for-profits are in fact involved in Arctic research. I'm sure from the very best of intentions, because we are all aware of the tremendous impact that climate change is having on the Arctic. But do you see a need for increased collaboration? What kind of experience have you had in terms of avoiding duplication of research, of somehow ensuring that we get good science done, but that in fact this knowledge is disseminated between the various groups and used appropriately?
Oui, Madame. Définitivement.
There are a number of institutions For example, the Arctic College, Nunavut Research Institute, Inuvik Research Institute, Yukon University in Whitehorse. These organizations are growing. They're growing in intellectual capacity, scientific capacity, and it's crucial that we work with them, even logistically, because they're on the ground, and also so that through them we can access an entire constellation of communities which they represent. They have people in communities. They're rooted there. We also need to include each individual communities. I agree with colleagues who presented here today. Every community needs to have an opportunity for a forum, for a meeting, to express their concerns. I worked in a Western Arctic community. Inuit had a solution to prevent deterioration of the tundra by all-terrain vehicles, because the whole discussion was on access to a national park. So we worked with them to make sure that their concept was technically sound, and it was an excellent experience. This is just an example. There are people at the Center of Northern Studies working on a community near Mitametaluk. They're working very closely with communities on animal biology, community members, and regional organizations like the Kititani organization are participating in the research. We would also be very interested in training people. Education levels aren't very high. A very small number of Inuit community members complete university. So it would be great to have them achieve that education and incorporate them into the studies so they can complete their training.
Recommendations there. Mr. Cockney, obviously you're part of the Arctic Research Foundation, which is clearly very interested in Indigenous knowledge and observations and contributions to their research. What is your observation across the Arctic with all these various institutions that do currently exist? To what extent are they incorporating Indigenous knowledge?
Yes, thank you for that question. Just as a side note here, as far as building capacity, you're going to have to talk hunters and trappers out of hunting and fishing to build capacity for sure. Anyway, as far as what I see across the Arctic, I think universities, researchers are, really beginning to align themselves with the community members, for sure, and they're I guess adopting the approach of, hey, what do you need? What are your priorities? I know that when we go into communities across the Arctic, that's what we ask for sure is what is it you're interested in, and how do we move forward in terms of research and science in your area?
That's encouraging.
Thank you. That's our time.
Is that?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we'll now turn to MP Blanchard-Joca for 5 minutes. No, I'm sorry. It's 2.5 minutes. Sorry.
Je vais prendre plus de temps, Madame la Présidente, avec plaisir.
I would certainly take more. You know how many questions I have. I'll continue with my questions for Mr. Allard. Mr. Allard, I'd like to hear you elaborate on the importance of continuing to study permafrost. It's releasing GHGs. It's leading to deaths. It's leading to more microbial activity, releasing viruses. So it may be happening in the north, but it has an impact everywhere, and these ecosystems are important everywhere. Yes, absolutely. I'd like to come back as well to Mr. Boulris's question on the carbon feedback cycle for permafrost. we really have to do a lot of measuring. Our knowledge comes from international literature, which is heavily based on mathematic models and Arctic-wide studies, but there are very few studies that are actually on the ground and that measure GHG emissions from thawing permafrost. Natural thawing, first of all, the accumulation of organic matter, the growth of plants, everything is changing the environmental portrait in Canada. I would even admit this scientific hypothesis that in the north we have a very useful carbon sink that should be measured and that could be counted in the carbon balance. So you would like to see support for research in northern communities. What would the priority be? To establish relationships, to visit. Our colleagues know this well. They know what it's like to work with communities. Researchers come to Tuktoyaktuk. They're very involved, a number of them at least, in coastal erosion. But travel in the northern regions is very expensive. Meetings are expensive. Not a lot of scientific equipment available in communities that we can use. We could develop and use increasingly easy-to-use technologies to collect data, take pictures, observe the land, exchange internet data. Young people could do this and work in their communities. So would it be a good idea for the committee to go?
It's the worst part of this job. So anyway, for the last 2.5 minutes on this panel, we'll turn to MP Boulouris. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Cockney, thank you for your kind words for my colleagues, my colleague Laurie Glut. Always glad to hear such things. What would, in your view, what should the federal government's priorities be for research in the Arctic? What are your priorities?
Yeah, as far as priorities with the federal government and the Arctic, I think pay more attention for sure because of what's happening in the Arctic. It's well known that the effects are incredibly prominent in the Arctic, and as far as our identity goes, our land claim agreement ensures that for sure. We are to maintain our cultural identity. If we are to lose our land, we don't have identity. So I think federal government needs to, put more resources and have the will to be in the Arctic.
Merci beaucoup. J'ai peu de temps. Je vais quand même me permettre d'une.
Thank you. I don't have much time left. I'll ask a quick question to Mr. Hannaford. You used a term that's quite loaded, really. You talked about the new colonialism of the North coming from China. In 1 minute, can you tell us what you meant by that? It's quite concerning.
It is quite concerning, and that's basically just that they're using this kind of soft diplomacy to make large investments into resource companies in the north. It's a good legal way in for them to do that. And my understanding is that they've also visited certain communities in the north as well, and have generally been turned away. But if they're coming in giving much more resources and bringing in a lot more funding than say at a scale larger than what the Canadian government is doing, then you have to ask yourself, why wouldn't the communities take their money? Why wouldn't they sell to people who are offering more? And as we've seen, they've already purchased a huge stake in a major rare earth minerals mine in the Northwest Territories. And the more that happens, I think the more of a jeopardy to our sovereignty and there is, and especially when you have to consider that again, this is the Inuit and Northern Indigenous land. These are land claims that belong to these people that they have sovereignty over. And Canada needs to be a good partner there and invest in resources and infrastructure, because if we don't, then other people are going to, and China is already showing that.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our witnesses. Michelle Allard, Tom Hefner, and Agnes Cockney, for your testimonies. You've given us much food for thought. It was fascinating listening to your testimony. You may submit additional information through the clerk. Please see the clerk for any questions. We'll suspend briefly to allow our witnesses to leave, and we will resume with our second panel of witnesses. Members attending via Zoom, please stay connected to this session. working. Yes. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefits of the new witnesses. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. It's now my pleasure to welcome from ArcticNet Dr. Christine Bernard, Executive Director by video conference. As an individual, Dr. Jackie Dawson, Canada Research Chair in Human and Policy Dimensions of Climate Change, University of Ottawa and ArcticNet. And the Centre for Nordic Studies, we have Dr. Norman Voyer, a professor. You will each be given a maximum of 5 minutes for your remarks, after which we will proceed to rounds of questions. I will signal you when you have 1 minute left. So I'll open the floor now for questions, and we'll start with Dr. Bernard to deliver her remarks first. Please make sure, oh, right, so yes, Dr. Bernard, thank you.
Hello, bonjour. Thank you for the opportunity to speak as a witness. As we are now seeing, climate change is happening in the north at unprecedented rates, more than 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the world. The consequences are dramatically affecting northern communities and all of us in the south. Melting glaciers, rising oceans are affecting coastal communities whose houses are threatened to fall into the sea. Safe access to hunting grounds is impeded due to unpredictable weather. Wildfires are devastating communities and ecosystems while acting as vectors for long-term transformation and accumulation of contaminants. These are just a few of the many dramatic impacts that demand investment in science to better understand and prepare for change and to monitor how systems are evolving and interacting, from sea ice to human health. After a pandemic and at a time of intense geopolitical tension, we should keep in mind a few lessons. Decisions must be based on evidence emanating from science and Indigenous knowledge. Science can be humanity's exit strategy from a crisis, whether it be a pandemic or cumulative effects of climate change. Cross-cultural, national, and international collaborations are key to developing and deploying solutions. The need for science and understanding and mitigating the effects of climate change and biodiversity decline is the most pressing issue of our time, in my opinion. The need for Indigenous knowledge is critical in recognizing and respecting its importance in understanding the North and the globe in a more holistic way. One of the most important lessons we have learned at ArcticNet is that research in the North is completely different from research in the South. It requires more time to build and nurture relationships, to co-develop projects and exchange throughout a project's lifespan. It requires more travel, therefore more funds, as work in the North is tremendously expensive and can be dangerous, with people needing the right safety and cultural training to ethically work with communities. Northern Indigenous peoples currently have access to several funding pots, but they do not necessarily have the capacity yet, nor the pool of researchers to apply and fulfill these mandates. The partnerships with academic institutions remain critical to uphold our commitments to achieving knowledge advancement in the North. There are certainly not enough funds for researchers in post-secondary institutions, given the realities mentioned earlier in conducting Northern research and the required engagement and relationship building. Inadequate research infrastructure is certainly hindering progress of Arctic research. There are a few great research centers that are operational within the vast territory of the North, such as Nunavut Research Center, Nunavut Research Institute, and Aurora College. But out of 60-plus research stations, only one, operated by Polar Knowledge Canada, receives adequate funding, while the 60-plus stations, which are distributed across all northern geographic regions and ecosystems, are in dire need of operations and maintenance funds. This is urgent to ensure safe and well-equipped stations are accessible to locals and researchers. ArcticNet, Polar Continental Shelf, Centre d'études Nordiques, Amundsen Science, and many others offer logistical support to access remote stations and vessels and sites, but again, funding does not meet the demand. Investing in Northern-led and Indigenous-led research has become the mantra of the North, yet we must recognize that this will take time and considerable investments. Funds must be invested in training and capacity building in the North, but this should not be at the detriment of academic research in partnership with communities to ensure we are exploring emerging issues and that there are no gaps in long-term monitoring initiatives. It should be noted that capacity and readiness is not homogeneous across northern communities, as some are extremely effective at conducting research while others are not there yet. Each nation and territory has its distinct issues and aspirations, and decisions must be made according to local, regional, and cultural distinctions. The conduct of research in the North is far from perfect, but giant strides have been taken to engage more meaningfully with Indigenous partners and to support reconciliation through self-determined research. So how we do research in the North is just as important as what research we do. One of the approaches at ArcticNet that we have seen to be effective is applying the principles of the National Inuit Strategy on Research in our projects. And ArcticNet has also created the world's first Inuit-led research program. So there are opportunities to build on this. So investment in northern research contributes to sovereignty and national security, increases resilience to climate change and reconciliation, while upholding Canada as leaders in Arctic research and Indigenous partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bernard. You had a few seconds left, so that's terrific. So we'll now turn to our second witness, Dr. Dawson. If you could give us a statement for 5 minutes.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I just want to begin by expressing extreme gratitude to all of you for taking on this really, really important topic. It's my absolute pleasure to be here today as a full professor and Canada Research Chair in Human and Policy Dimensions of Environmental Change, as a lead author of the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, and as the current scientific director of ArcticNet. Your committee's study is particularly important right now, and that is because Russia's invasion of the Ukraine has meant that large portions of the global Arctic is now offline for research activities. As a result, many, many European researchers are moving their research programs to the Canadian Arctic. Not only does this situation put pressure on Canada to ensure that we have proper measures in place to support this shift, it also means that we have lost a substantial amount of data from the Russian Arctic region, thus decreasing our ability to accurately model climate futures and changing Arctic ecosystems. Climate change in Canada's Arctic is and will continue to have significant consequences across local, regional, and national and global scales. It is not an exaggeration to say that these changes have the potential to completely reshape and change the world as we know it. This is not just due to melting ice caps, glaciers, sea ice change, for example, but it is also because of the cascading effects that these biophysical changes will have on society. For example, altered freshwater fluxes in the Arctic Ocean from melting ice will lead to variations in the Gulf Stream, which we expect will then lead to changes in the climate, not only locally, but all the way to the mid-latitudes. Conversely, the drought conditions that are being experienced nearby the Panama Canal and the horrific ship attacks that are occurring nearby the Suez Canal, combined with the reductions in sea ice that are occurring right now in the Canadian Arctic, mean that we are likely to see a coming shift in global maritime trade activity to newly opened Arctic sea routes, including potentially our Northwest Passage. Shipping is a $1 trillion industry that supports 90% of everything that is moved globally. And a shift of this nature, although potentially economically fruitful in some regards, will also create a cascading set of risks related to geopolitics, the environment, and Indigenous culture. These are just a few examples of the cascading effects of climate change, and of course the question is, what do we do about it? Over the past 5 years, Canada's status as a leader in Arctic science has grown internationally, especially with respect to Indigenous peoples. Countries all around the world, Arctic and non-Arctic alike, regularly look to Canada for guidance on not just what science is urgently needed, but also how science should be done. As a nation, we have made important improvements in this area through for example, Arctic's North by North program, the National Research Council's challenge programs, and others, but there is a lot more to do. At present, there are several competitive funding programs available to support Indigenous engagement and leadership in science, but there remains a lack of training and capacity for local communities to meaningfully engage in these projects. It is important to point out that Canada is the only nation without an Arctic science strategy. And in fact, there are many non-Arctic nations, such as Italy, India, France, and China, that have Arctic science strategies. Although discussions are beginning about potentially establishing an Arctic science strategy, which is different than an Arctic strategy, we need this sooner rather than later. This is already the lack of leadership in this space has already caused geopolitical and diplomatic challenges over this past year alone, and this is likely to continue. One way that Canada is beginning to assert some leadership in this space is through the Emerging Arctic Pulse Initiative, which is a Canadian-led international science mission that is planned between 2024 and 2030, with a major field season to occur in 2027. The initiative will link together existing projects and seeks to leverage additional resources to ensure that Canada can play a leading role in this space. In conclusion, supporting a coordinated and connected Arctic science ecosystem in Canada that is underpinned by strong government supports, including a national Arctic science strategy that leads us and sets priorities and connects the various institutions together, will be fundamentally important as we move forward. It will help us ensure globally relevant discoveries, economically vital innovations, self-determined approaches to sustainable development, strong international relationships among like-minded nations, Indigenous reconciliation, and urgent solutions for climate change mitigation and adaptation in Canada and around the world.
Merci, right on the button. Thank you. So now we will have an opening statement from our third witness, Dr. Boyer.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam Chair, committee members, good morning, and thank you for giving me a few minutes to tell you about the difficulties of northern populations. I am Normand Foyer, chemist and full professor at Laval University. I focus on natural products in Canada's far north. Today I represent the Centre for Northern Studies, founded in 1961. It is based at Laval University and forms a strategic research network with other Quebec University. The CN is an interdisciplinary group of 61 researchers assisted by professionals and technicians. We have 7 research stations in Nunavik, 2 in Nunavut, and we have a network of weather stations in eastern Canada that stretches from James Bay to Ellesmere Island. With members of northern communities, we are in an excellent position to witness the substantial repercussions of climate change. As has already been said, the far north is the region that is warming most quickly and warning the most. This is due to a phenomenon we call Arctic amplification. I won't go through all of them, but for a broad view of the changes are happening in the Arctic, there's an excellent article by my colleague, Professor Warwick Vincent, which I've tabled. The North doesn't have the resources, tools, or funding needed to conduct needed research. The communities themselves lack financial, human, and equipment resources to conduct research projects that can meet their immediate needs and concerns and make it possible to train new generations to participate actively. No laboratory has the instruments needed to validate water salinity and medicinal plant chemicals. The same goes for instrumentation for measuring emerging pollutants and PFSAs, microplastic, for example. We often need very fine-tuned environmental data. These strategic data are vital for monitoring environmental changes and for decision-making. The data are rather scattered, and one problem is that research stations and environmental measurement centers are aging and need significant investment to upgrade and fund them. There is no specific program in Canada to meet those specific needs. Moreover, there are few sources of funding that make it possible for Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers to work closely in analyzing the data and putting them into perspective. With regard to making sure that research is significant and relevant, that's not being done with sufficient care. For example, the Imagirit project, which was co-constructed with scientists from local communities to study pollution in the George River, which is essential to traditional activities. That is one example. Another project was working with healers and knowledge keepers in the Korean Inuit community of Wapamagutsi Kujurapik to study medicinal plants widely used in these communities. There are very limited examples, though, because the challenges of co-constructing projects with northern communities are enormous. Distances are huge, transport costs high, internet access is limited, and there's a lack of human resources and co-construction sites. The idea is that we have to work with northern communities, but it's difficult because of the underfunding of initiatives such as the Polar Continental Shelf programs. The only way of moving ahead with projects that are relevant to communities and meet their needs is co-construction, so they need to be given the means, as do we.
Thank you very much. Again, we're doing great with the timing. Thank you so much. So now then, we will open it to questions, and we will kick that off with MP Michelle Garner for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. There's so much to touch on. Where to begin? So I think I'll start with you, Dr. Dawson. So I think you made a really important point about the lack of an Arctic research strategy. So when I've looked through the recently released defense strategy, which says that it's going to advance the goals of the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework. And when I look at those two documents, the whole concept of data analysis, research presence, what Dr. Barnard was talking about, maintenance of research facilities, presence, that's like, there's no harmonization of that whatsoever. So in terms of recommendations, would you recommend that the defense strategy and Canada's Northern Policy Framework be linked together with a formal research strategy?
Yeah, I mean, those documents should be harmonized, period. But yes, I strongly feel we need a clear and formal research strategy that is coming from the federal government, that directs the science community, sets priorities, and then, most other nations have this. And then it helps you decide what to do. And it helps you work together as a global community. There are many, many research stations. There are many, many researchers. And we're all doing priority setting exercises. And I can say from ArcticNet, we would love some guidance on that through a strategy.
Were you, because I've known ArcticNet even prior to politics when I was in academic research admin, were you consulted by the federal government either on the defense strategy or, okay, so that's a no? No. Okay. Do you think that there's an opportunity as we are getting more pressure as a country from NATO allies to increase our NATO spending to target some of that work or expenditures on research and research presence in Canada's Arctic?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very strategic way to go, right? Because we are required to do that. And so absolutely we need to do that. And we need to be thinking strategically about all our research. All research should be multi-purpose. Now, that doesn't mean I don't believe in pure scientific fundamental research. However, in the Arctic, what we need is applied science that has multi-purpose, be it for infrastructure development, defense needs, et cetera.
Expound on the why. My assumption would be the why for that type of research is multifaceted. it's not only to understand the ecosystem and impacts of X, Y, and Z, but it's also to inform public policy, particularly on defense.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes, yes, and yes.
How, to me, it seems impossible that Canada can make strategic decisions on defense strategy in the Arctic without understanding, for lack of a better term, how it works. Would that be a good why for why Canada needs an Arctic research strategy that's tied into its defense strategy?
Yeah, that's one. That is one reason, and a very important reason. I mean, we don't even have. I can't remember the percentage of the Arctic that is charted to modern standards, but it's very limited, and we have a lot more traffic, and we need to understand these things, and we need better satellite infrastructure too.
Okay, that's a whole other hour of questions. But yes, if you would like to put on the record that part of our research strategy is sovereign satellite infrastructure,
I'd like to put that on the record.
Great. You need another 2 hours here. How do we, to me, if we are going to proceed with reconciliation as a principle of any sort of Arctic strategy, how can we proceed with reconciliation if we don't have a research strategy that includes Indigenous traditional knowledge? I guess what I'm trying to say is, to me, it seems very short-sighted that we've now got a defense strategy and a northern strategy that doesn't bridge those things with Indigenous traditional knowledge.
Indigenous traditional knowledge and the inclusion of people in the north, especially Inuit, because of the population in settled land claim areas, is essential. I actually forget what I was going to say.
Where I'm trying to lead you down the garden path with this is if we are going to recommend to the government that they have an Arctic research strategy that bridges the defense strategy and the northern strategy, does Indigenous traditional knowledge need to be part of that?
100%. It absolutely, and they need to be leaders in it as well. So there needs to be leadership from Inuit in that space. Yes.
You talked, the last minute that I have here, you talked about this now becoming a diplomatic issue. Could you give the committee a recommendation, like a concrete recommendation, that would address those concerns?
Again, we'd need 2 hours, but I can give you one concrete example, a recommendation. Canada needs to lead in this space, period. The Arctic is our front yard. We are an Arctic nation. And I would argue that we are not currently seen as leaders in this space. We are leaders in how we engage and how we engage with reconciliation, but we are not leaders in science.
Why do you think it is? Why do you think we're not seeing that? I have a short time, but I think that's important.
We're not coordinated. We're disjointed. We don't have priority setting exercises. We're not organized. We haven't focused on the Arctic, and we absolutely need to. Non-Arctic nations are taking the leadership space, and that is causing diplomatic challenges.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. That was very interesting. So now we will turn to MP Arre for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Dawson. Arctic is not, I will not say totally new to me. About 12 years back, when I was in private sector, I formed a consortium of DRDC, Royal Military College, companies like Raytheon, General Dynamics, about 10 or 12 different small-scale industries, with the Royal Military College also involved, to form a center of excellence to focus on integrating the technologies that is being used in the north. There's a whole patchwork. I think it still is. There's a patchwork of technologies that are being used, where I thought that we can integrate the technology so that for the monitoring and surveillance of the Arctic can be done in a better way. That was the thing. Anyway, it was not approved by the government. I don't know what is happening on that front. Another thing, even another witness and you both mentioned about the shipping, commercial shipping going ahead there. But please be assured it will take another 25 to 30 years for that to happen. It is going to happen, but it takes 25 to 30 years. Coincidentally, last week I met the Singapore ambassador to Canada, who is also Singapore's ambassador to Arctic issues. So I was quite surprised. First thing that flashed to me was that Singapore, being a big shipping is in the big shipping point. I thought he was talking about commercialization, but he agreed that it takes 25 to 30 years. But he emphasized they're looking at Arctic from the climate change point. And obviously, we all are aware of the problems created by climate change in the Arctic and elsewhere. The problems and the impacts are emphasized again and again. I am not very sure that we will be able to keep the global warming within an accepted limits when North America, we still have coal-fired power plants, including 4 provinces in our own country. And to see another rich developed country like Germany restarting many of their coal power plants, when we as rich developed countries, we are taking measures to continue and restart coal power plants. I don't know what we have, how we can influence or encourage the global south to do their part too to fight the climate change. We can go on and on on this. My question is that the Arctic Net, they mentioned how wide their collaboration is with so many different universities, so many different agencies, so many different countries. Are we spreading our resources too thin? Are too many players involved in various aspects of research? Are they duplicating the same things? What is your views on that?
My views on that question are no. It's actually in some ways a small community. I walked in here and I know Michelle Allard quite well, and we know each other. We create review systems so that, there are the occasional duplication, but we are so far from understanding the region that is not the risk. The risk is that we don't work together to understand these large-scale systems. And I'd like to add, you mentioned the Singapore ambassador to the Arctic. We do not have an ambassador to the Arctic. The U.S. has an ambassador to the Arctic. We are. That's right. We're all ambassadors to the Arctic. I would argue we need one. Yeah. And you mentioned Germany. Germany is the leading Arctic science nation in the world. Not us, Germany.
But still, again, Germany is the country which restarted its coal power plants when the first pain hit them. Then you can imagine how the global south were economically backward when they're still yet to see the basics of the life which we take for granted. How do we ask them to tighten their belt? So that's another thing. You also mentioned Arctic Net. I was looking at their website that they collaboratively work with international research team from Denmark, Finland to Spain and all. There's no mention of Russia or China in their thing. Maybe it's a new thing. They have taken that off. You also mentioned about the lack of data, rather the loss of data. That is very important. So in the Cold War, I think there was some sort of collaboration amongst the scientists and researchers between the previous USSR and the Western Bloc. Do you think there's any possibility like that happening? Because Arctic is too important for anyone.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. As scientists, wearing my science hat, we are hopeful that there is going to be room for that. But considering the atrocities that are ongoing right now, it's a difficult step to take. We also endanger Russian scientists, our colleagues and friends, when we ask them to engage. So it's a very complicated, sensitive subject, I'm sure you can understand. And we're looking to Arctic Council and our government for guidance on that.
Obviously, the funding is the thing. Every single witness coming to any committee in the parliament, one of the things we need more funds. Yeah, always. So always. Yeah. And obviously, there's always a limited resource that is available.
Yeah. There are ways to leverage and connect, and that's what we need to do.
Exactly. I understand. That is where a formal strategy where the available resources can be channeled to important areas or which can stop the duplication of the work so that it can all be done. And in addition to the strategy, is there any?
Thank you. That's our time. Sorry. I know. We could all go on and on with this study. So again, now we have MP Blanchard-Chalcas for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I find it interesting to talk about coal-fired plants plants in Germany? What about the pipeline that's going to take 6,000 barrels a day from the tar sands? That has an impact on permafrost as well. Sometimes we have to look in the mirror and see how clean our faces look. I would invite the minister to compare ourselves to other countries that don't always have the best of climate change records. My question is for Mr. Voyer. You mentioned that the Arctic is the region showing the fastest global warming. How will research improve our ability to fight global warming? That's a great question. And it would probably take me a couple of hours to answer. We have talked about coordination, funding. One thing we don't have in Canada is a clear long-term strategy. The important word is continuity. There are often one-time projects. For example, the Innovation Fund does one thing. That isn't good for the Arctic. We need continuity. The Arctic is changing and changing fast. The only way to keep up and adapt is to have an ongoing source of good data that takes a network of research stations and teams of researchers that will work together longitudinally. What we have are one-time, fairly short-term projects, and we're always redoing things. What we need is a long-term strategy like the Europeans. A 15-year strategy would make it much more possible to conduct research with some continuity. You can't measure impacts in the far north with a 3-year program and then starting again with a different program, because each time you have to resubmit for funding, resubmit for grants. So, yes, we do need more funding because this is all very important to Canada as a whole and to the communities in particular. We haven't talked about the impacts of climate change on communities, but in the north you see these repercussions every day. Greening of the north has impact on food safety, food security, and on medicinal plants, and on ways of life, and on migration patterns of animals that have traditionally served as a food source in the far north. So it does take a long-term strategy that's coordinated with a research strategy for the Arctic, which will provide broad guidelines for ArcticNet and other organizations and research groups involved in the far north. And this would, of course, include traditional knowledge. Thank you. So what you need is data, and there's no database that will at present enable you to share data for the North and the Arctic. That's one point. There are tons of data. There's data here and data there, but what we don't have is financial support that would make it possible for all these organizations to pool these data and to make them available to communities with explanations, with understanding. We can also integrate traditional knowledge and the changes that keepers of knowledge have in communities. I'd also like to see us come back to what you stressed, the disastrous consequences on our future of warming in the Arctic. Oh, that would also take hours to tell you. We know what impact it's having. If you looked at Vincent Warwick's article, it's not just the changes in the Arctic that matter. The changes in the Arctic have repercussions on the South far greater than we might have thought. The forest fires that carried smoke all the way to New York, that certainly made the headlines internationally. But repercussions will continue to be exacerbated because the Arctic is changing very quickly. 2 or 3 times more quickly than other regions. You know, it's Newton's laws. Energy is neither created nor destroyed. Nothing is created or destroyed. It all remains within the system. So ice melts, sea level rise. Huge impacts. Yes, thank you. Thank you for helping us gain a better understanding of how significant these changes are. They have not been enough of a priority. What's lacking is continuity. We have difficulty in upgrading and maintaining our stations. A trip can cost $15,000 to get to the north. The whole infrastructure isn't adapted for co-construction. The systems aren't adapted.
Okay, so now we will turn to MP Bulgaris for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to our experts with us today. Professor Dawson, I'd like to begin with you. You talked about the Arctic opening up with ice melting, and you talked about the geopolitical repercussions this would have. Let's put a name to it. Russia. Russia planted its flag on the sea floor on the North Pole in 2007. How do you view this gesture by the Putin regime unilaterally claiming sovereignty over a significantly large part of our planet?
One of many gestures, the most overt, absolutely. I'll say I'm a climate change expert with interests in geopolitics because these things are intertwined. I'm not a security or a political scientist, but I think it's quite clear that there are interests in the Arctic. There are resources in the Arctic that we don't even know exist yet. We've been looking for uranium, diamonds, oil, gas historically. With the movement towards EVs and other things, we're going to be looking for nickel, cobalt, and others. We haven't even, probably we know some of it. So it doesn't surprise me at all that this is happening, and I anticipate it'll continue to happen. I think the subsurface is what concerns me the most. We have satellites, we have some ability to understand and to monitor the top, but what's going on underneath, I'm not sure.
Et ça peut engendrer des conflits, malheureusement.
This could unfortunately lead to future conflicts. You focused on the fact that shipping was increasing, that new shipping routes would be opening up, and that this could be advantageous or problematic or even dangerous. Do you believe that the federal government is well prepared for this considerable increase of shipping volumes through these lanes?
Non, je ne crois pas.
Tout simplement. OK, merci.
Very simple answer. So what should the federal government be doing to prepare?
Well, first of all, it's taken us, 18 years to build a new icebreaker. Our capacity, I think we have, 6 icebreakers, 5 really. They're all at end of life. We are building these offshore patrol vessels. They aren't necessarily going to be, useful in the high seas. They're definitely useful in the near shore, what they're designed for. I think we're extremely slow to be building ships. One thing that's extremely positive, though, is Davies Shipbuilding now owns a shipyard in Finland, which I think will help us get around some of the challenges we've had in building ships. We can't build ships in China who can build them cheaper and faster. I understand why we don't do that, but now I'm hoping we can speed this process up. So, yeah, but we are not ready right now.
Oui. On a des besoins dans.
We do have shipbuilding needs that haven't been filled, and that has come up time and again in my years here. Professor Voyer, you talked about the impact of thawing ice on sea levels, and that will affect everyone because oceans go all around the world. This could certainly be a problem for low-lying lands like Bangladesh, but there's a great deal of construction on shorelines. London, for example, many large cities in the world could be hit. At the beginning of your presentation, you said you were a chemist and you specialized in natural products in the far north. With climate change, there'll be an impact on both fauna and flora. These natural products come from somewhere. Are there natural products coming from the far north that are threatened? What changes in the vegetation and plant life are you seeing? Yes, and there's even an impact on small places, small towns like Tuyaktuk. What we're seeing is not just warming soil, we're losing biodiversity. And when you lose biodiversity, you lose chemodiversity. There are natural substances in plants that can have extraordinary properties. 40% of the world's pharmacopoeia is rooted in plants. With global warming, plants adapt their metabolism. Some will disappear, and we might lose, for example, the first ever drug to treat Alzheimer's. Our research has shown that a very small fungus from Iqaluit Bay, from Frobisher Bay, if you'd rather call it that, can be used to treat malaria. What really caught our attention was that communities in Wetnagushi and neighboring areas use a small plant for their traditional medical needs. The plant is used widely. For the past few years, they've noticed some side effects to this natural infusion, and they wanted us to help them understand what was happening. Because of global warming, the plant's summer cycle is leading it to produce different substances at different moments, and one such substance is toxic. So the point is, we need to determine now when the best time to pick that plant would be so that its therapeutic effect can be maximized and its side effects can be minimized. Biodiversity is something we tend to forget.
That's very interesting. In fact, it's a little over our time. So now we will start our second round of questioning, and we'll start that with MP Law.
Madam Chair, the topic of this, as you folks well know, you got the invitation, science and research in Canada's Arctic in relation to climate change. And probably a good place to start is maybe what happened hundreds of thousands of years ago, and try and educate ourselves on what happened back then, where the ice shelf was lost. And I just wonder, Jackie Dawson, for the benefit of us all, can you tell us what happened, the best guess, that many years ago?
Yeah, I'm not a paleoclimatologist, so I look more into the future than the past. But certainly, as you know, all of us understand the ice age and the changing conditions we've seen. We have had ice times and non-ice times. We all know that. The difference now is how rapidly it's happening, not that it's happening. It doesn't surprise any of us as scientists that we are seeing a warming period, and we've seen cooling periods. But the extent, the timeline that it's happening is way faster than we've ever seen before. And there are certain periods, like the last ice area has been here for over 2 million years, and we expect that to be gone within the next 20-ish. So, yeah, I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I'm not a paleoclimatologist either.
And from your experience up there, there will be people studying this years ago and all the way through to continue to learn with what's going on.
Absolutely. People take ice cores, for example, and the ice cores help us to understand. And so Konrad Gajowski, for example, Dorte Del Jansen, those are two people that would have a very good understanding of this.
And I think all Canadians feel it's their responsibility to do their best to, be mindful of what they're doing and their contributions, personal and also commercial, industrial. But if we're taking an honest look at the Arctic region and we look at some of the Russian businesses that are conducted, they're almost emitting all of the emissions up there. So we can do our part, yes, but if Russia is contributing to almost all of the emissions, what are we to really do here? Like, we can really, is our job just to study the continued impacts of Russian pollution and the impacts on our Canadian side of the Arctic? Is that really what our role is going to be?
No, and I think you're right in the sense that the pollution coming from the Arctic is coming from Russia, and that's really reflective of the fact that something like 72% of the circumpolar GDP comes from Russia. So our contribution to circumpolar Arctic GDP is about 2.8% or something, 3%. So we're completely underdeveloped. They're pushing development. So from my perspective, it's actually not the Arctic that's the problem. It's other places around the world where we have to focus on mitigation efforts. Even Russia is emitting limited greenhouse gases per population compared to other countries. So I hope we can make some strides at the UNFCCC, the United Nations UNF climate change. We all have to come together, and I think we need to make money. We need to make money on an energy transition. That's how we have to get people bought in.
Okay. Approximately, maybe I should know this, but approximately how many Canadians are currently doing research in the Arctic and contributing to that research? Is it hundreds? Is it...
Point d'ordre, Madame la Présidente. On m'informe qu'on n'a plus de traduction.
Point of order. I'm told that there was no interpretation.
Okay. So we need to add a little more time and go back a bit. How long were you missing interpretation?
Ce n'est pas moi, Madame la Présidente, c'est pour les gens qui nous écoutent en ligne.
It's not for me, Madam Chair. It's for people who are listening to us online. They do need interpreting in both official languages.
Le test, ça semble...
Can we do a test? Is it working now? This is the English channel.
Now, is it working? Can everyone hear in both languages? Oui. Oui? Okay, good. So I'm going to give a few more minutes time. Ask his last question. I'll re-ask that last question, and I'll give you a little bit more time, so that the interpreters can get it.
Ça. I guess the question was, how many Canadians are working directly or indirectly on Arctic research currently?
The answer is I just don't know.
Okay.
And this is a problem, actually, that we don't know. We need to know. We don't have an inventory of the projects, programs, and we can put that together, but it hasn't been done yet.
Yeah, and I appreciate that answer because we're talking about a strategy, an Arctic research science strategy. Great. Because like Mr. Arias says, almost every meeting I've been at since I've been on this committee, somebody says, geez, give me some more money. But in this case, if you had a strategy, you would be able to pool it all together and say, okay, this is waste, this is good, this is duplication, this is triplication. Let's do it. So I think that probably should be a highlight in the report, I would think. So how's my time doing, Madam Chair? 5 minutes left?
No, actually, you down 2 seconds, but
2 seconds?
no, down to a matter of seconds.
Okay, I'll cede my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lobb. Okay, so that takes us over to MP Longfield for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. I want to go over to Dr. Bernard. We had people mentioning Arctic Neck, but we haven't heard from you directly yet this meeting, and so I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. When I look at how Canada participates in Arctic research with other groups in the world, and where collaboration is happening, but it seems like there is a gap that Arctic Net is helping to bridge. And could you maybe talk to us about how ArcticNet is working to try to bridge science research going in Canada, as well as through your working groups, how you're contributing to some of the research outside of Canada?
Right, thank you. So ArcticNet is really one of the primary conveners of Arctic research across Canada, and I would even say across the world, because we can bring multidisciplinary researchers together through working groups, committees, science meetings. One of the core criteria to be funded through ArcticNet is to have teams composed of researchers from different institutions to train HQP, highly qualified personnel from different institutions. So that automatically brings people together from different disciplines and institutions, thereby increasing the aspect of collaboration and contribution. And with our working groups and our committees, we make sure to bring people from all northern regions and our research management committees to make sure that there is that information exchange from different regions that are brought to these committees. And I think this is absolutely critical that we recognize the heterogeneity of our northern landscapes and peoples, to hear their voices on our committees and working groups. That's absolutely critical. And we do have this power of convening because we're not stuck in a federal department or agency or with the private sector. So when we were building our application for the Strategic Science Fund, we actually wanted to hear from everyone what the science priorities were in Canada and internationally. So we brought together over 300 people to discuss priorities in Arctic science. And people across from government sectors are telling us, wow, it's the first time I'm actually working with other public servants on this issue, but we're both Arctic researchers, but we don't have a place to come together. So I think ArcticNet really does have that convening power, if you will, of bringing people together across sectors, because we do fund researchers from universities, Indigenous organizations, Inuit organizations, and the private sector as well. So I think that's a big strength of ArcticNet there.
If you'd be able to provide us with the most recent output that could help our committee's study on Arctic research, then we could also appreciate the critical role that ArcticNet is playing in these discussions. I'm thinking of the Arctic Council that was also mentioned earlier, and what's the interface between ArcticNet and the Arctic Council?
So the leadership, Jackie Dawson, myself, and Philip sit on various working groups of the Arctic Council. We also we're looking to fund Canadian Arctic experts to sit on these working groups to contribute to these assessments that are touching on various themes such as biodiversity, contaminants, freshwater across the north. So ArcticNet does bring experts to these tables and sits on these working groups to make sure that the information does trickle down to the research community. I think that's one of the biggest problems perhaps in Canada is when we have some agencies sitting at these tables, there isn't that trickling of information down to the research community.
So there's a gap. And Canada being one of the 8 founding members of the Arctic Council and always being respected. But if there's a gap, we need to identify that in our study.
Yes, we do. Absolutely. I'd be happy to share our science priorities report with you.
That's terrific. I've only got 30 seconds left. I'm thinking of budget 2024, 46.9 million over 5 years, going through Natural Resources Canada to the Polar Continental Shelf Program. How does that interface?
That's extremely important. It's providing researchers and Northerners access to remote sites to conduct that research. One of my points was specifically addressing that we don't have the funds to meet the demand to access these remote sites.
This funding includes travel and it includes expenses for people to get to those expense out to reach places.
Yes, it's logistical support, whether it be fixed aircrafts, airplanes, or whatever you need to access those remote sites, as well as the possibility to stay in Resolute Bay before you're brought to other remote sites. So
we just have to pass our budget. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bernard. Okay, so now we will have MP Blanchette-Joncas for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Mais
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Mr. Voyer. I'd like to come back, Mr. Voyer, to what you said a few moments ago about the importance of co-constructing scientific research project hand in hand with Indigenous communities. We need to focus on how research funding is focused. Universities get most of it. 15 universities receive 80% of research funding in Canada as a whole. What's your view on this? Would it be a win-win if universities or educational centers engaged in scientific research are physically close to the area where the research is conducted? For example, Yukon University, with current funding distribution, they don't necessarily have funding to do research that is focused on their own areas. That's a very good question. Establishing a research tradition takes a long time because the training takes a long time. We've worked with the Nunavik Training Institute, with Yukon University, but the tradition will take time. These educational centers are already engaged in research and do receive funding. The question I have no answer to is this: do they have enough? Enough to meet all their needs. 85% of research funding goes to 15 universities. We would probably see the same thing in the US and other G7 countries. We need research funds allocated to projects that directly affect communities and do them through co-construction projects relevant to Inuit and Northern communities. This will require specific programs. What there is at the moment is we take existing programs from the Health Research Institute, for example, or other centers, and from the Canadian Innovation Foundation, and we try to export them up north and adapt them to how things are there. That's totally inappropriate.
We're getting close to the end of the meeting, but thank you. So for our final round of questions, that goes to MP Boularice for 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Professor Voyer, your explanation of this little plant that can be used to make an infusion and can have negative side effects was fascinating. You said that in the north there is no laboratory that can analyze drinking water purity. Is that true? Well, there's a laboratory or laboratories, but they lack funding, instruments, and trained people to work in them. This is particularly true in Nunavik. I'm less familiar with Nunavut, but drinking water is a significant problem in northern communities, and we need the instruments to help us develop capacity, to help us teach communities the capacity to test water for coliform bacteria, TSFAs. Nickel mines can leach radioactive chemicals. Or cobalt mining, for example. We need better equipped laboratories with better trained staff. You also said that it would take investment just to maintain current capacity, not even looking at developing them. No, it's one thing to set up a lab with instruments. It is something else to use them professionally. You need the right training for that. Thank you, Madam Chair. That's it for me.
Is he finished? Okay. Really appreciate that. So anyway, thank you so much to the witnesses, Dr. Bernard, Dr. Jackie Dawson, and Dr. Norman Voyer, for your testimonies and participation in relation to the study of science and research in Canada's Arctic in relation to climate change. It was a most fascinating session. So you may submit additional information through the clerk, and please see the clerk for any questions. So given that we ran a little bit over the things I was going to discuss briefly, we will send out with an email just to put you, just a heads up for things that the committee needs to think of going forward. Is the committee in agreement to adjourn our meeting? Thank you very much.